We're back. Trail science. You guys thought it was over. It isn't. It's great to have Simon De Waal joining us again, all the way from across the pond.
Thank you.
Yeah, Simon, thanks for being here and making the time. And after much deliberation, the topic of today's trail science episode is training load monitoring. Simon would never call himself an expert in this, so I will do it. But
Thank
this
you.
is something that is forming part of his PhD, which he's busy with. It's something he knows a lot about. This is how our first conversations about trail running started back in the day was,
Wow.
yeah.
I can actually remember there was a time when maybe you were masters or honors, and I was like pre-PhD, post-masters, and thinking about like what I wanted to do for my PhD. And I thought like for a while, and I used to harp on about that Van Rentegem article,
So
Jos
good.
Van Rentegem. And I used to harp on about it. And I was like, I really want to do my PhD in training load monitoring. And then, I mean, you're not wrong to say it's kind of part of my PhD, but it's not the main thing in terms of I'm much more in the physiological space. And yeah, it's strange almost how far we've come over so
Yeah.
many years. It's probably been 7, 8 years now since those early days of training load monitoring talk. So it's good to be bringing it to the Trail Science podcast.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think first thing that kind of the general person thinks of when they hear the words training load monitoring. Simon, what were your first thoughts when you came across that kind of terminology? Let's frame it for
Yeah.
those who have no idea what we are talking about yet.
Well, when you listen to runners, I think the first thing people always think about is total distance, right? It's like how far do you run? And
Yes.
if you're not clocking like 100K or 100-mile weeks, you're not a proper runner kind of thing. So I think training load monitoring, I want to say historically in the running space has been largely centered around how much volume one completes, and that might be total distance is the common metric, but it could also be time spent training. When you talk about a load, you're talking about any stimulus or stress to the body, and obviously that's a cumulative function as you do more training every day, and for all the days preceding, those will all affect you in some ways, and certainly for the months preceding that as well. So you've got this general fitness that you build up over time in response to these micro stresses or daily stresses and stimuli, and then you've got the fatigue, which is like a much shorter window, maybe the last few days, and how that affects your body. And so I think most people who know a little bit about training load monitoring, they might know that I think it's Andy Krogan training stress balance, TrainingPeaks kind of model,
Yeah.
which is an extension of how much distance and time do you spend running, but it also incorporates heart rate. So of that time spent training, in what kind of zone, at what intensity was the exercise? Was it a kind of highly stressful bout, or was it moderate intensity or low intensity? And you can get something called a training stress balance, where you might either have like a really high acute fatigue and maybe a really low chronic fitness, like a long-term fitness, and that means that you're definitely in a poor training stress balance, like you're not ready for competition. Or if you've planned your training really well and you've built up a really good fitness over time and you've managed to reduce your acute fatigue, then you would be in like a positive training stress balance, and you're ready for competition. So I think a lot of that early training load monitoring science came from, I think it's either Andy Kogan or Krogan.
Yeah, I
Forget the
think Kogan.
exact
Yeah.
Kogan.
His kind of lactate threshold models, all of those things are still
Yes.
used. Yeah, very cool stuff.
Yeah. So I mean, that I don't know again if Kogan was the one who initially kind of positioned the functional threshold pace test, or I know that
Joe
Joe
Friel.
Friel is quite big in that space. Again, all of these tests come from the laboratory initially. Like I was actually reflecting on Colin's episode with you recently, and I don't want to rehash stuff that he kind of said, but the Kogan and Joe Friel and all of these types, those functional threshold tests, those field tests of like 20 to 30 minutes, and you're kind of trying to get a best representative of where your anaerobic threshold might be. It is essentially a gauge for coaches and athletes to know when they're in zone 3, which is above the anaerobic threshold, and then when they're in zone 2, which is between the aerobic and anaerobic threshold, and then when they're in zone 1, which is below the aerobic threshold. If you want to know more about that, you can go and listen to Colin's podcast with you, Em.
Awesome.
But those in, I suppose, training load, if we say training load is any stress or stimulus on the body, the framework or the model that we use to analyze that load is really important, because, there's certain physiological adaptations that take place within each of these 3 zones. So it is important to understand, like, how much training are we doing in each of those zones.
Yeah. Hopefully, if you're listening to this, you do run. And if you don't, I encourage you to do it. We were just talking earlier about how great it is just for everyday things. But caring or understanding training load monitoring is, as you get into running, you run more or want to progress to a competitive level. It's essentially, I'm investing a lot of time in the sport. What does that actually mean? What does the time spent mean for progress? Measuring a baseline, remeasuring later on. But Simon, something you mentioned earlier, and this will speak to the difference again between road running and trail running, which we spoke about, the mileage. So distance versus time spent training. And for anyone who runs road, knows that 100 Ks on the road could probably take a decent athlete less than 10 hours of training a week. 100 Ks in the mountain, depending who you are and where you decide to do your 100 Ks, could take you up to 20 hours a week.
I was going to say two or 3 times longer than that, probably. I think the trail running space is still evolving at an even quicker pace than the road running space. But the road running load monitoring environment is also changing rapidly as the market and technologies kind of change. We can get into that later in the podcast, but I think you got to consider with trail running. And when I started out trail running, I can remember every kind of coach that I spoke to always harped on about time on feet. That's really important, because when you move through the mountains, you do move slowly. And so being able to handle that stimulus, that specific stimulus, and again, if you talk about road running, I've got to move my center of mass quickly, as fast as I can, over a relatively flat portion of road where there's not going to be much vertical elevation change. When you put a mountain in front of somebody, all of a sudden the pace slows dramatically when moving that center of mass uphill. There's a much greater metabolic cost. So breathing rate, heart rate, oxygen utilization all increase dramatically when you run uphill. And then when you run downhill, there's actually also the kind of caveat where you think, oh, now I can kind of let go and I'm going to have an easy ride down. And then you've got all the kind of inflammation, the eccentric muscle contractions that occur, you decelerating your body with every step that you're taking. And you've got much, much higher vertical ground reaction forces when you're running downhill, which puts strain on the lower limbs. So I think the training load itself, it's easy. We can say it's still important in trail running to monitor distance and time on feet, but are there maybe some other measures that might be important to monitor that are specific to the sport? And the coaching wisdom of time on feet is undoubtedly very good consideration for athletes. And then I would also say probably depends on how long the races that you're trying to do. Some races I've seen, like these maxi dark races, Emily, in Yonkers, and I'm seeing, I don't know, Jacques and Charles and Christian running in front there, and they're running, I don't know, 15 Ks in less than an hour on trail with like huge verts. So
and almost zero visibility other than their lead lenser. Yes, it is wild. Sending it downhill at 3:30.
So you can think like guys like that are running crazy paces, like the magnitude of the forces acting through their lower limbs are going to be much greater than the magnitude of the forces of someone who's running much slower. However, the person who's running slower is spending more time on feet, perhaps taking more steps as well. So measuring and quantifying this is important for injury kind of. I don't want to say injury prevention, because I'll get a slap on the wrist from your supervisor and my co-promoter, Professor Fenter, for saying injury prevention. But kind of try and trying to manage and reduce that risk, and then at the same time optimize performance. So there's two kind of main things that we use load monitoring for.
Yeah. And Simon, I mean, you've not alluded to it, you've said it now, but the difference within the training load monitoring between kind of elements that we're measuring to measure them. So your cadence, your step frequency, your time on your feet, versus now you mentioned like deacceleration, eccentric loading on the way down. That's more kind of the physiological side. I have visions of the kind of pictures that are in an article that I can't remember the name of now, that kind of really nicely summarize the different sides to training load monitoring. So can we get into that a little bit? And with the training load monitoring, I think of actually first guest ever on this podcast was Johan van Heerden, otter champ, great athlete. And his dad coached him when he was younger to be a track and field athlete. And his training load monitoring was a handwritten logbook. And since then, I've spoken to many people I remember who've done the handwritten logbook thing. And I think Johan still uses that technique despite all the the cool tech and programs that are out there. Yeah. And there's been a couple more people, even someone like Alan Robb with Comrades. He's still, to this day, the logbooks, that's where it's at. So, I mean, I think that's also evolved over time. And you mentioned
it has, but the principles are the same in terms of kind of trying to log what you have been exposed to. The whole idea with how we go about training is we have this theory on how the body adapts to a stimulus. So we have different models. So the one model that was an early model in the space was called the stimulus fatigue adaptation model. So in other words, you apply a stimulus to the body, and this is not only in like physical stuff. This could be you go to a piano lesson on Sunday and you learn, I don't know, the ABCs of piano. And then that's a stimulus. And the initial response, certainly when this could be cognitive in the case of piano, but it could, when you talk about a physical stimulus, there's a fatigue response. So there's wear and tear, muscle breakdown. There are certain byproducts of metabolism that need to be cleared from the working muscle so that you're ready to train again and to compete. And there's certain recovery that needs to take place through sleep and eating and drinking. So you've got the stimulus. Hopefully it's been a good stimulus, an appropriate stimulus. Obviously, if you're a trail runner, the best thing that you can do is run on trails, and that's a good, appropriate stimulus. But we're trying to manage that we're not doing too much too soon. Then there'll be some fatigue, and your body needs time to repair. And then you have the adaptation phase. And so if you allow an adequate amount of time and a proportionate amount of time to the work that you've done, if you've done a really long session or a really hard session, then you apply a little bit more rest and recovery. If you apply adequate rest and recovery, your body actually adapts to that initial stimulus and it becomes stronger. And so those principles, like the hearts of the world, and I know, again, Professor Fenter, who used to run kind of way back when, and she still has her logbooks of the training that she did back then. And it's incredible to think how much hard work went into manually logging each and every session. But I think, again, a lot of these principles do come from that track background, where if you had a coach or your dad standing the side of the track with a clipboard and a pen and a stopwatch, and you were running, I don't know, 2 minutes every lap, then we know that you're running 5-minute Ks. And so we can measure not only how far you've gone, we can measure how long you've been training, we can measure your average pace for those sessions. And again, that pace becomes really important because we know that at certain paces, we get a certain stimulus. So if we want to really kind of increase that aerobic capacity, we might want to go out on like a relatively short stimulus like interval and apply kind of a 1-to-1 work to rest ratio. And that work intensity is going to be at higher than that lactate threshold, like greater than that threshold, which you could have determined back in a lab. Back then, you would have to do that based on pace and the stopwatch technique. You didn't have other technologies that helped to support whether you were exercising that at that intensity. So now we have elite athletes are not just doing heart rate monitoring, they're doing blood lactate analysis while they're running. So they can see the exact lactate concentration. So they know exactly what type of metabolism is being stimulated. And you and I can agree that it's not really useful for you to stand in Yonkers at the bottom of the road, and then for somebody to run up to the top of the mountain and run back, and we say, right, your average pace was 20 minutes per kilometer.
Yeah.
You might have done, based on how far it looks from here to there and the direction of the sun and the casting of the shadows, maybe you ran like 15 to 20 Ks. It's like, that's just not going to be good enough to give us a sense of the load that your body's been exposed to.
Yeah.
And that's where we're seeing, I suppose, more and more technologies creep into the space to try and give us a better picture of what's happening.
Yeah. And I think with that, Simon, I mean, I want to get into a little bit about the limitations of some of the tech and kind of applying a lot of what we know of training load monitoring and running coming from track or road. And then a lot of it does work in the trail space. And then there's obviously exceptions where it's being developed. So for example, TrainingPeaks is a very well known program as a training load monitoring tool. It's accessible, it's easy to use. There's a lot of pros. Some of the cons is, especially when I started using it, it doesn't account for elevation gain and loss when it comes to the training stress score. And even now there are updates being made and it's starting to account for it in a way, but the little calculation that it spits out is essentially based on your pace, your heart rate, and the time. And as TrainingPeaks gets more information from you and your training history, and everybody has watches, it becomes smarter the more information you give it. But even with that, I still see now your 3-hour long run with 800 meters of undulating vert in Jonkershoek. If I took you and put you at altitude in the Drakensberg or in the desert, it's similar time, distance, we could even say pace, but could we then say this is the same training stress? Yeah. So this is an interesting thing. Yeah.
That's the issue with those models, is that so predominantly they, at least historically, I'm not aware of any changes. They are related to time and heart rate. So time and intensity and heart rate, and it gives you a score in what I would call arbitrary units. So we, in the training load monitoring space, you get something called TRIMP, T-R-I-M-P, or training impulse. And there are a plethora of different TRIMP models. Like, it's not just as simple as there's only one way to calculate a TRIMP score. But essentially, these Kogan models, training stress balance, they originated, at least, let me be generous and say maybe they're not like that anymore, but they originated in this kind of TRIMP space where I could take you mentioned a 3-hour long run, right? With 800 meters vert, or let's say 1,000 meters vert. I could say, right, well, the 3 hours is 180 minutes, and the average heart rate for, let's make this easy for myself because my maths is not great. The average heart rate was 100 beats a minute. And so I can multiply the duration by the average heart rate or the average intensity. And I can say that the TRIMP value in arbitrary units is 180 multiplied by 100, which is 1,800. Now, the issue with those kinds of models is they're really not very sensitive to the kind of work that's been done. So you might have an athlete who did something quite similar, 3-hour long run, 1,000 meter vert in the Drakensberg, and instead of doing maybe 20 kilometers like your undulating 800 meter athlete did, they did 10 kilometers in 3 hours, or 15 Ks, and partial pressure of oxygen was lower. They had to go considerably slower to account for that. Because they went slower, there are maybe different forces acting around the ankle, the foot, the knee, the tibia, kind of upper leg, hips. Center of mass, vertical oscillation, might look very different. And so on paper, the training stress balance is 180 times 100.
Yeah.
But what is happening within the body might look extremely different. The average cadence, like you said, might be very different in those two kinds of runs. And so, there's two issues. One is the sensitivity of the model, and there have been many iterations of TRIMP to try and account for that. So one of the early ways, going back to the 3-zone model, was to say, right, well, now that we can track heart rate using a chest strap, and we know where the aerobic and anaerobic threshold are, what we'll do is we'll multiply the time spent in zone 3 by 3, we'll multiply the time spent in zone 2 by 2, and we'll multiply the time spent in zone 1 by 1. So we create like a weighting factor to basically say that time spent in zone 3 is harder than time spent in zone 1. So when I get my training stress score for that workout, it will be inflated if I spent more time in zone 3. And we might say that that's a good thing, like that's a good principle. We're trying to get to a more sensitive space, but who's to say that training in zone 3 is 3 times harder or has 3 times the stimulus as training in zone 1? And so I think there's some issues with these models, and they're there to guide and inform. However, we know that there's a large inter-individual variation, differences in responders, like responders and non-responders. I might respond very different to a stimulus than you do. And they might not be measuring all of the important things, as you rightly mentioned. There are other things that maybe we want to look at, which is circling back to that paper that you talked about, which is a novel framework for training load monitoring.
Yes. I'm gonna link it because I feel like any sports scientist in our year would hopefully have read that, at least in honor. I hope so.
I've annoyed them with it, yes.
But I like what you were saying now. Not all zones are created equal, or not all time zones are created equal. But there's just so many kind of avenues to take with that, because it's it's like, what are you training for? Everybody.
Do you do that in your training, Em? Do you do training zones with your athletes, or how do you prescribe intensity? Obviously, you coach a lot in the trail space. So what do we have from a coach perspective at the moment to kind of prescribe that, I suppose?
So when I started coaching, that was when the whole zone 2 buzzword, I think, came onto the scene, or like shortly after I started, let's say that, where
is that in a 5-zone model, like a low aerobic zone, or is that are you talking about threshold?
I'm talking about the 5-zone model.
Easy, so very easy.
Conversational pace, and athletes are starting to realize that the old school term or approach of go until you blow for every session just isn't going to cut it. And maybe my brother-in-law, for example, he still is a good athlete, but he was a very good 400-meter runner when he was at school. And his dad used to stand on the sideline and tell him, okay, Sean, you're going to run your race now, and just run until you taste blood. And then that you've done it. You've nailed the 400, and that's maybe not sustainable. Well, maybe it did sustain. He did it throughout his high school careers, but sporting career, but just tell someone at the start line of 100 miles, go until you taste blood. That's probably also going to last about 400 meters. And then that's
if you're tasting blood within the first 400 meters on a 100-mile race, you are in big trouble.
So I think when I started in the space, it was this whole thing of, zone 2 is the place to be. And I feel like as I grew as a coach and watched my athletes, there was a lot of merit to that approach, because I think a lot of runners, when they start, everything is just too hard. Because again, you're starting either a new sport, or you're introducing a new stimulus and going from the road into the trails, which for anyone who's done that, or Simon tricked you into running to the cross at Stellenbosch Mountain, it's hard, it's difficult. And so,
do you think they do that because they get sucked into a trap of, is there a culture of you've got to keep up kind of thing? Do you know what I mean? I agree with you that that's an issue with novice runners, is not knowing how to. And I used to get a lot of athletes coming to me and saying, because we would use heart rate zones to prescribe intensity, and then they'd say, oh, I'm going up this hill and I'm having to walk to keep my heart rate within the zone, like zone 2. And I'm like, yes, you do have to walk. Do you know what I mean? So it was almost like a foreign concept to them to dial it back in a way.
And I think that was a huge thing of then people became either the complaint was, I can't get my heart rate down. And again, this is not something you do once and you magically have the physiological adaptation to control your heart rate as you run uphill. That takes years and years. But then the flip side of that was too much zone 2 and not enough intensity, where I fell into that trap myself. And I unfortunately coached people into that trap, where we were so focused on the aerobic engine and building that base that you would train 80% of the time in zone 2, very infrequently or every now and again dip your toe into a couple of intervals and spend time at speed or at kind of your higher end speed. And then I would ask you to race in zone 3 and be at that sub lactate threshold.
And you're not comfortable with that.
And then you just fall apart. because,
Yeah.
and you're fearful, your heart rate goes up, and then you're like, what am I doing? And da, da,
Yeah.
da. And I think, to answer your question, as I've kind of, this is now trying to summarize the last like 7 years of what I've learned,
Yeah.
but there has to be more than one metric that we're looking at. So heart rate, it is great. There's a role for it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think especially for beginner athletes, everything is just red zone. I'm talking beginner. Even if you're trying to run easy, or if you're running hard, the difference in beats per minute is maybe insignificant. So you have to almost force that differentiation significantly. The walk run technique, you need to learn what that feels like. But then we know a lot of things affect heart rate. Your stress, have you had caffeine before your run? There's a lot of things, your sleep. So
sleep, yeah.
That in combination then with RPE, rate of perceived exertion. And
do you use RPE within your load monitoring? Because at one point I became so almost like not disillusioned with technology. And this sounds like really strange coming from me, because I do love my technology, but sometimes you just get, and I remember you talked about your very first episode, and he talked about running otter with nothing, just going on feeling. And sometimes I felt like you get so metrosized, and your athletes are looking at their heart rate on their wrist, and then they're looking at their pace, and then they kind of suck the joy out of it. And I actually did some RPE, so training prescriptions. So I think there's a difference between prescribing training. You should try and run in this zone for this long.
Yes.
And then the monitoring process is essentially a check. It's a check your balances.
What actually happened during the session. Yeah.
Exactly. So do you use RPE as a monitoring tool or as a prescription tool, if that makes sense?
Both, but I would say a prescription tool first. And with that, the whole thing with running, Simon, and this is something that's kind of come together in my mind only in the last few months. And it's that just what you said now, of athletes are looking at their watch and their pace and allowing that to dictate or tell them how they feel, which is a huge problem. And I've been there.
Backwards.
Yeah. I've been there where I'm like, and I think I listened to oh my gosh, his name just left me. Jim Walmsley's like rival, Zach. Is it Zach Miller? I'm like, this is embarrassing. The guy's second at UTMB, the whole anyway. And he had this thing where he was racing Jim on a different race, and they've got this rivalry. And then someone said, oh, bro, you were like running up this hill, and I could hear like by your breathing that you were redlining. And he was like, dude, I was chasing down Jim. Like if I was running up that hill and it told me my heart rate was 200, I still would have run as hard as I wanted to run, because I'm racing the guy. It's like, that's not the time to be like, my heart rate's too high. So what I'm trying to say here is like the combination of the two, because again, RPE in prescription, you're trying to teach athletes to understand that what do different training sessions feel like. And if every session feels like your VO2 max intervals, we have a problem, so then let's talk about it. What does aerobic training feel like? What is the difference with, your more anaerobic sessions? And then there's a lot of gray area and crossover points. And I'm all for the lab and lactate testing. I love it. I do it. I use it. But it's also becoming a bit of a, my lactate threshold. And I'm like, it's not a piece
of the puzzle.
It's a piece of the puzzle. And also session averages. If you 3 beats over for less than 4 minutes,
well, that comes down to how you use this kind of technology. So if you don't understand what you need to do when you do blood lactate testing, in terms of like, if you want to get a steady state, for example, you need to run at you need to have a good warm up, and then you need to run at a consistent speed for, I would say, a minimum of 4 or 5 minutes. Up to maybe 12 to 15 minutes at a particular pace. And then you can get a kind of consistent lactate measure. And depending on the type of implement that you use to measure your lactate, if you disrupt the tissues, like if you're doing finger prick analysis and you actually disrupt the tissues, or you take the first blood off the tip of the finger, you might not get an accurate recording. And then the question is, every time that you are doing lactate collection, are you doing the same process every time? Are you restricting and controlling your diet every time? Are you exercising at the same time of day every time? Are you doing the same thing in the 24 hours prior every time? Because that consistency in how you actually do these things is really vital as well.
And I think that's where I'm seeing value in, I'm a total numbers nerd. I love all of it, but it's like the bigger picture, and a lot of the stuff I've been chatting about is like the human, and I think that's where, so heart rate and RPE are two things. And then for the road athletes, like pace, it's there. your speed.
Yeah.
It's very important. If there's very specific time goals for an event and it's a more experienced athlete, and then you can look at things like, if you can't do it in training, you won't do it on race day, So for example, setting realistic goals. If you in your training can climb or can run 6 kilometers an hour with an elevation of 300 meters, when you pick a race with a similar kind of terrain and gradient, and you're saying, okay, I'm basing my time goal on the fact that I'm going to run 10 Ks with 700 meters of elevation. And then that's where you can use the training load monitoring tool, your TrainingPeaks. I go back, I show athletes, this is what the work that's been done. This is the goals that we've got. This is how far out we are. These are the sessions that your heart rate says one thing, your RPE is saying something else. How can we? So you start to, again, the puzzle piece. And I've recently had an athlete who I've worked with for a really long time where, I mean, if you look at his heart rate in terms of what was prescribed and what was done, everything looks fantastic. If I speak to the human being and that subjective feedback, he's like, something is very, very wrong. And essentially one of the things that he's struggling with is he's got a couple of food intolerances and allergies, and he's been figuring that out. And essentially, because nutrition is this massive part of running, so his daily nutrition is not right. So he starts his run and he feels terrible because his stomach is sore. If you've ever tried to run with a sore stomach, it's awful. His heart rate is low. He's a fit guy. He can do the session, but he finishes and he's like, oh, I feel awful. And so that's that important, that like
it's human, like problem solving for that particular athlete. And again, I think like when you think of anything that we talk about really in trail science, I think you have to consider that there is huge variation in terms of how people respond to training and to those stimuli, that stimulus fatigue adaptation model. And some people need more rest and recovery. And so I suppose that's the training load monitoring is a principle, but it needs to be used effectively and specifically for each individual.
And the training history is also huge, Simon, like what you said now of how people feel. And, when it comes to training prescription, it's almost like I tell some of my athletes, like, RPE is there, but you have to earn the right to use only RPE for a session, because then I get athletes who are like, my RPE was 2 out of 10. But
you need to trust. So
but everything's pointing to redlining.
Yes, exactly. So a really good article on kind of what leads to effective load monitoring. And the number one thing that leads to effective load monitoring of athletes is a relationship of trust and open communication between the person who's doing the monitoring and the person who's being monitored. So you can take all of your fancy gadgets out, and that's the number one most important thing to effective load monitoring. And the second one is having a robust kind of management software. So you talked about your heart and, the old diary logbook. Now, that's not going to be sufficient if you are a trail runner running in the mountains for long periods of time. You need to have something that allows you to capture, process, and analyze that data. So don't forget about how fancy the technology is. You need to have something that you know how to work with and you understand the metrics that are given, which is my issue with some of these kind of generic platforms, because are we as athletes or coaches or whoever's using them, do we really understand the algorithm that's gone into generating this insight that you get out of it?
Trusting the process and the person who's monitoring the process. So I think you have that coach-athlete relationship, and some athletes do kind of monitor their own training, which is a whole different thing. But something that I know James Montgomery and Meg McKenzie, kind of a mantra that they live by, and it pulls through to their athletes as well. A couple of them have been on the podcast, and something Daniel Claassen has really done a lot this year in repeating this mantra is being process and not outcome focused. That speaks to results, but also the training load monitoring. Because I mean, that's where we spend 80% of our time. And even at MUT, when my athletes were finishing, regardless of the result, and a lot, they had great results, but I was like, the hard work that you put into toe the start line is actually the thing that I'm like most proud of. I'm like, there's no hype, there's no finish line when you train, there's no people with cowbells. That's you getting up day in, day out, being consistent. And I feel like this whole thing, training load monitoring, is like overlooked because, you just hone in on that single day result. So,
I think it can, for some people, it can be used as a motivation tool. So, my background in load monitoring started in completely different area, was in soccer or football. And actually, or field hockey, soccer. And I know that even in that space, things have changed so much because the Hurricanes used to use load monitoring. So those of you who know the Hurricanes are a super rugby team from New Zealand, professional rugby team. And they used to use load monitoring as a motivation tool. So they'd have GPS trackers, much like you as a runner would have a watch. They've got them on their back, and they would use that to track how much high-speed running these athletes had done in a training session, or how much time they spent doing kind of sprinting activities, or how many quick accelerations or quick decelerations they've done. And they literally have leaderboards in the locker room. And so when, I don't know, Conrad Smith came into the changing room, he could see where he was in relation to somebody else in the team. And they use that as a means of like, players that aren't putting in the work, they need to aspire to get up to a certain level. I think some people love that. You know, now the difference is now that they used to do that after the session. So with the rugby players, they would take the GPS pods off them, download the data, and then put it into Excel or write it up onto a piece of paper and put it on the wall. What they do now in that space is they can live track the load that the players are being exposed to during a session. And so you'll often find, in competition in those kinds of sports, players get hooked off the field after 60 minutes because they've reached a weekly mileage that they don't want to exceed that threshold for a certain variable. So, it's not just in the trail running space that this is developing at a kind of really quick rate of knots. But I think some athletes that I know, at least, they really love having a Strava or a TrainingPeaks where they can kind of see that progress over time, right? And the consistency in their training. I think that's a nice way to keep it process oriented, to say, look at the steps that you've taken to get where you are. On that, I think you mentioned kind of that training load distribution. What we know, again, from kind of large data analyses, if you look at like long periods of time and really high level athletes, is that they do spend the overwhelming majority of their time in that zone 1 in a 3-zone model, or zone 1 and 2 in a 5-zone model. So that but kind of aerobic threshold or below, they're spending 70 to 80% of their time there. And it's kind of some people believe in a kind of polarized, so no time in zone 2. But if you kind of take the sum of all training and races over multiple seasons for endurance athletes, you tend to get this kind of pyramid model where the majority of work is spent in that low zone, and then a little bit less, maybe like 20% or 10-15% in zone 2, and then kind of 5 to 20% in zone 3. And so the load monitoring allows you over a period of time to get a sense of like how much training are we doing in each of these specific zones. And you said earlier, like some recreational runners fall into the trap of doing too much in that kind of zone 2 space, and essentially that just inhibits your ability to recover adequately to then go and do the key sessions that you need to do in your zone 3. And so I suppose it's something to keep in mind when you are doing the load monitoring, is are you able to get a good sense of, over a long period of time, process wise, are you ticking the boxes in terms of your load distribution?
And being open to the fact that it's going to change and look different based on your goals as you progress as an athlete and as you spend years and years in the sport. I think that's an interesting space I found myself in recent years. People who've been running for 10 plus years and who are still looking for margins of improvement and how to change. And essentially, it's like that definition of insanity, the good old one, is like doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome. And it's like you need to not be afraid to try something new within, zone 3, or don't listen to the buzzwords always. I mean, there is merit in not just training in the black hole of one zone, but it's not just zone 3. Like zone 3 gets a bad rap.
Well, there's good evidence that like the better trained you are, so if you've been running for a long period of time, you are more robust to not only higher loads, you can tolerate greater loads, but you can also tolerate greater variation in your load. So if you're dealing with someone who's just starting and 1 week they're doing 50Ks, and the next week they're doing 10Ks, and the next week they're doing 40Ks, and then
Not
nothing. And then that kind of fluctuation is because they don't have that training base. They can run into some injury related problems really quickly, to do with the repetitive loading of the joints that are responsible for movement, for locomotion, which is a nice segue back into that novel framework for training load monitoring. So the old frameworks used to use external and internal load. So they would quantify training load into two broad categories. External is the stimulus that's applied to the body. So you did 10,000 steps, or you ran 5 kilometers, that kind of metric, or even something like how much time did you spend doing exercise. And then that's an external stimulus that has some sort of effect. It's going to induce some sort of effect on the body. But the internal load is a measure. So we need something to measure. So internally, you would measure heart rate, which is the body's response to that external stimulus. But there are other things you can use to measure internal load, like perceived exertion, which you talked about, blood lactate. There are creatine kinase levels. There's so many things that you can measure, kind of that respond when there's a stimulus on the body. But the novel framework that was put forward by Van Rentegem and colleagues, they basically said, yes, okay, it's good to know that we can put things into these external and internal bins or categories. However, have we considered the fact that the load adaptation pathway for a stimulus to the cardiovascular or the metabolic system is different to the load adaptation pathway, which is kind of triggered by a stimulus to the musculoskeletal system.
Yeah.
So when I go for a run, and again, this goes back to trail running, yes, I have a heart rate response. Heart rate increases linearly as oxygen demand goes up. It gives us a pretty good measure of the intensity of the exercise. However, heart rate is something that I would call a global measure. So the reason your heart rate increases is because the demand for oxygen increases.
Yeah.
Now, we know that muscle contraction and muscle co-contraction looks very different when you are hiking versus when you are running.
Yeah.
So even if you have two people on a 20% gradient, the peripheral oxygen demand, so in other words, at the site of the muscles, the local muscles that are working, looks very different when somebody is walking to when somebody is running.
Yeah.
And so I can measure heart rate, which is a measure of global demand, but it tells me nothing about the minor differences between how much the medial gastroc or the soleus or the rectus femoris or whatever, how these muscles that are responsible for moving me up the hill, how that changes, how the demand on them changes.
Yeah.
And I think the really exciting part of training load monitoring is we are now getting to a point where we can start to hypothesize and measure, probably indirectly at this point. But instead of these kind of just having external and internal loads, we can now separate loads that are being applied and stimulated to the biomechanical or musculoskeletal load adaptation pathway, and then loads and how we are stimulated and how we adapt to the cardiovascular system.
And that's like a classic thing of, again, learning to differentiate. Like, was this hard for you cardiovascularly? Like, did your heart feel like it wants to pop out of your chest? Or was this a case of like, my legs, people speak about, I couldn't turn my legs over fast enough, or I had DOMS, depending on like that sore
my
muscle.
legs were heavy, or
there's like those phrases that you hear in the day to day, and then if you understand and go and nerd out and read the articles, and then you'll be like, oh, that phrase actually comes from a scientific background. Like, there's just not a random thing that people say. So, and that makes me excited.
Yes, well, even with rating of perceived exertion, which you've said you use in your load prescription and your load management or monitoring, it's a measure of exertion. And it's normally on a scale from 0 to 10 or 6 to 20. And it asks you how hard was that effort. And, 20 out of 20 is like maximum effort, really hard. 17 is very hard, 15 is moderate, whatever. But there's increasing evidence to suggest that we should use kind of variable rating of perceived exertion scales, exactly like you just said. Instead of having one measure of RPE, if you want to consider the physiological load adaptation pathway as separate to the musculoskeletal, is to have your athlete complete 2 RPE scores. One is a breathlessness score. So lungs, chest, how did that feel? And the other one is a muscle soreness or tiredness score. And all of a sudden, you're able to get 2 metrics that help you to discriminate as a coach between what kind of a load was that. Because the whole reason that they argued for this novel load adaptation framework is because the mechanism of injury is very different for like a repetitive overuse type injury than it is for a cardiovascular kind of injury. So the construct of heart rate variability, everyone's measuring heart rate variability now. We've got these like ambulatory measures where we can measure these things instead of just a clinical measure, like a once-off, this is your HRV, we've just monitored you for 5 minutes. This is your variability. You're wearing some sort of sensor that can monitor your HRV for 24 hours a day. And I get so many, athletes and people saying, oh, this is my HRV. I'm in, good training status or whatever. Like that comes from a clinical setting where patients who had suffered a cardiac event, they would be monitored via EKG for a subsequent event. So that when you're at the greatest risk of having a heart attack is just after you've had a heart attack, essentially. And so, getting to the hospital is really important, even if you've had a kind of a minor cardiac event, because you're at a much greater risk of suffering a subsequent one. And what they found in these clinical settings is that patients who reported with a very low heart rate variability were at a much increased risk of suffering another cardiac event than those who had high heart rate variabilities. And so they knew that heart rate variability was telling them something about the autonomic nervous system, this system that like monitors the unconscious processes in the body, regulates kind of breathing and metabolism, brain function, and all of that thing. That like they knew that it was telling them something. And then we thought, oh, right, well, it's telling us about like cardiac events. Maybe it will also tell us about like your general autonomic nervous system state. Like, are you in a recovered state, or are you in a stress state? And my question is still then, and I still don't know this because I don't monitor my HRV. How is that HRV being monitored? Because in a clinical setting, it's being monitored via an EKG, which can measure to thousands of decimal points, thousands of thousandth of a second or whatever. Are we monitoring it on wrists where we're measuring like pulse? We're not measuring the actual electrical signaling of the heart. We're measuring the change in the diameter of the radial artery as blood passes through. So we're measuring pulse rate. Are we actually measuring HRV, or we're measuring that indirectly? And that leads into like all of these technologies essentially is cool. We've got so many technologies now, but how much do we actually know about their validity and their reliability? And that's where I think the market booms, the industry booms, and consumers are like, oh, new technology, this is the best. Oh, this is my, we're talking about, this is my power, my watts going up the hill, and this is my HRV and my sleep score and my whatever. But are they actually valid measures? And the research, unfortunately, the research is behind the industry. The industry moves so quickly that by the time independent academic researchers can get hold of that equipment, test it, validate it, publish about it, there's already 5 models down the line.
Yes. And I think that's, I mean, the things, the fads are like fads, like they will fade because people will eventually realize, even if the research is still in process of being completed, certain things just out themselves as being like total nonsense. And some things are harder to predict. The HRV thing's been super interesting for me. But once again, it's like, are you going to allow your watch to tell you how you feel? So I got into a super bad habit after being incredibly sick actually last year, and then constantly like waking up and looking at my HRV to be like, am I better today? as opposed to going, do I actually feel better? What is my like feeling as a
Yeah.
human first? And then
Yeah.
there's room for this, there is, and it helps you make decisions. But also sometimes you just have to be like, this is,
Yeah.
like we said, diameter of the radial artery, not the EKG. I'm not dying. I'll be just fine.
Well, I think that's so, you mentioned this earlier, like having multiple measures is so important, because if your HRV score, your variability is low, in other words, it's giving you a bad number, and maybe you're tracking wellness, and your wellness score is low, profile of mood states, or your recovery stress kind of questionnaire or something like that from a wellness perspective, and you go for a run and your RPE is higher than what it normally is for an easy, I'm sure you do the Jonkershoek horseshoe loop as a fairly standard run, and maybe you normally do it at like 8 minutes a K or 6 minutes a K or whatever, like that's a like standard run, and like my RPE is really high, so all of a sudden you've got a wealth of evidence that's suggesting that, hey, something is wrong here. That's when you can use it to say, okay, maybe I need a few more days before I'm ready to go. Or if you're a really high level athlete, you're doing multiple training sessions in a day, you have these kind of standardized sessions that help you to measure where you're at in terms of your kind of feeling. And many of these athletes will do 2 sessions a day. So am I in a good state for my next training session based on how my body's responding? Yes or no? Should I be going hard or easy? So it's about kind of checking the evidence, checking the logic. Does it make sense in terms of and learning to trust your body? And that's why I said, if you've got a coach and they're doing load monitoring, if you don't trust the process or you don't trust them, then you might as well just stop doing load monitoring. Like, there's no point. You might as well just have a chat with them and say, this is how I'm feeling, and off you go. And I think nothing will ever replace that. And this is the one thing that I'm really stoked about, because I'm increasingly in the literature seeing things like machine learning, the use of AI to train predictive models. So if I take 10,000 trail runners and 5,000 injuries, and then I go and tell a machine to mine the data from the 6 months prior to those injuries occurring in these 10,000 athletes, it can eventually develop an algorithm or a model to help me understand what are the things that I should look out for in terms of loading that might predict an injury or an illness occurring in the future. And I think with those models, the one thing that I suppose I'd be out of a job if this was the case, because I'm not strong in this, but one thing I'm always gleeful about is that this conundrum of injury and performance is so complex. That these markers and these measures are really struggling to tell us with a high degree of accuracy. And so it is about using them to inform decision making. Coaches will still have jobs, as far as I know, for the next little while, and so will sports scientists. But I do think that that's the future of this, is that we collect so much information now. Is can we use machine models and AI to help us kind of process that wealth of data to predict adverse events?
It's amazing. I'm excited. I believe there's a cohort of American coaches who are working on something. They say it's not secret, but we're still waiting for the big reveal, and it's got to do with kind of the coaching process and AI, and how we can use both the human element of the coach and the technology to just produce better athletes. So I'm all for that. And reduced injuries, more training continuity, happier athletes. Sure, that sounds sign me up.
Yeah, that's a good thing. But I think all of these gadgets and all of these like value adds, like training load monitoring is a value add. The most important thing is getting out the door and going for a run.
Yeah,
do you know what I mean?
Someone actually has to do it.
And so I think that's the rabbit hole that you don't want to go down. Is this is the most, and one of the things that maybe got me moving away from it in a PhD sense as well, is it is so complex, and injury and performance are so hard to predict and measure. So I think that coaches will be around for a long time. I think that as an athlete, you should be working with a coach who understands the limitations of the technologies very well.
Yes.
That doesn't have their head in the sand in terms of I'm ignoring any advancements or changes in practice and in best practice in my field, but is also critical, skeptical, and I think that that's really important, because if you're just otherwise you might as well just go to ChatGPT and say, write me a training program.
Yeah.
And it will scour the internet for every runner's world training program that's ever been published,
Yes.
and say, this is what you need to do, and off you go. And for a lot of people, that'll be just fine. For some people, it will be completely inappropriate, because we are all different, as we keep harping on about. But I think you need to work with a coach, a human being who you trust, who understands the limitations of these technologies, but also knows when to use them.
Yeah.
I think we're not going to be out of jobs for the next little while. We
Yeah.
can rest easy at night.
And that's actually, Simon and I were having a chat just before this, and that's probably going to be one of our next episodes, is looking at the different technologies that are available in terms of wearable tech. So we kind of spoke about a few programs now for training load monitoring, but what is feeding the programs the information? And that is the thing that most of us are never without one of these, or
one of those,
a pod, or
wrist.
whatever.
Yeah, we can get, maybe we can look at some of the like validity and reliability, like, again, advancements in this field. Like, it's not just heart rate anymore, but now I can get an indirect measure of the forces acting on the lower limb, like the tibia, which we know that there's a lot of running related injuries, shin splints and stress fractures and ITB, runner's knee, all of those kinds of things. So I can get an indirect measure of the force acting through the lower limb, but I'm using some sort of equation with these like power meters and accelerometers, IMUs, inertial measurement units. I'm not actually measuring the force acting on that tibia, like through that tibia. That's the thing, that bone that is so important in translating forces from the ground up into your body and vice versa. In order to actually measure force going through there, I've got to do something a little bit more invasive than that.
Yes,
and so
that no one will ever approve for ethics.
And so whenever you get like a probe, let's say, embedded in the muscle belly, measuring the force of that muscle or contraction or excitation, it's going to be different to something that's on the surface of the body and something that's kind of creating a prediction. So there's error there. And when there's error, there's the risk that your whole load monitoring process is kind of tainted in a way. So we'll definitely look at some of that kind of evidence, I think, in that next talk.
Yeah.
Because I think it's important that people understand that.
I agree. And it's a good reminder. I mean, even for me, it's hard not to get excited sometimes when you see something new or trending come out. But it's good to be informed, understand, what was the origin, what was this originally designed for, where is it being applied now? These are all great questions. And as the sport grows at the rate that it's growing, these are important questions. So yeah. But Simon, it's always so fun chatting to you. I felt like I was low energy coming into this one, and now I'm like all excited about training load monitoring again.
Yeah. I'm glad I could be of service.
And yeah, we are looking forward to our next chat. There's also some very cool things in the pipeline, which we'll reveal at a later stage. But Simon is on the side of all the Gen Z listeners. So yes, you can expect some exciting things where we do use technology to our advantage to further educate the listeners on the things that we're nerding out about currently. Yeah,
you got to stay relevant. I think that's important. You don't want to become a dinosaur too quickly in your field. So we'll try and bring some fresh and exciting things. But it's always a pleasure to talk to you, Emily, and looking forward to whenever we sit down together next.
Awesome. Thanks for your time, Simon.
Cool. Cheers.